Hey everyone, I'm just showing a little bit of a sneak peek at a solo game I did over the weekend of Sharpe's Practice. Now, admittedly, this isn't going to be just, it wasn't designed to be a battle report like typically with my more live action updates of rounds that I would do Musket and Tomahawks. I actually did a bit of a solo game in order to get myself more accustomed with the rules again. Like, I've looked through the rulebook several times, but I've just not really sat down and kind of worked the rules. And so, for those of you that may remember, I've played Sharpe Practice in the past, but it's been probably 2 to 3 years. And when I did play, it was only a couple of games, and it was with a friend who knew the rules and hosted the game, so to speak, really sort of walked me through it. But I never really reestablished that by playing the game regularly or even leading games myself with the rules. And so in some ways it almost feels like starting over, although having said that, some things come back pretty quick. So here you can see that I just set up a sort of basic table in the dining room, and what I have here are my two forces, and I'll show them a little closer to just show how I designed them. So I designed the solo game for that day to be somewhat symmetrical, but I didn't make it exactly symmetrical. I did stick with regular type units and I didn't include skirmishers of any sort, things that had some more variety within the rules. I just wanted to just get some of the basics down. And so on the British side, I do have 3 groups of regulars on the left, and they are supported by a leader with an initiative level 2 on horseback, so a leader 2, as well as a leader 1 next to them. And then below them I have a small group, so not a formation, but just a group with a leader 1 attached as well. And then on the right here I have very similar, but instead of a group of 3 strong, in the formation there's just a group of 2 with a leader level 2 and a leader level 1, similar to the British. And then I have a group of Canadian Marines, and so they do have a different unit profile, but they are also regulars, and they are supported by a leader level 1. For the force morale chart, I just had the British as first because I kind of designed them first when doing the designing of the 2 groups, and I have them represented on the top and the French on the bottom. And so the British started out with a little bit of a advantage in their force morale at being at 11 and the British at 10. So this is just a snapshot of within the first round of the game. The British deployed more in the center of the table, where the French deployed a little bit. You can see towards the edge of the table up in the top left. To give you the update as to why it looks like this, essentially, it turned out in the first round that, coincidentally, a lot of the leader cards that you use to activate your leaders normally were towards the bottom of the deck, and lots of the flags were towards the beginning. So it was just a bit random in that sense. That of the 2, the French actually did have some leader cards come out early, and so they ended up deploying fully on the table before the British. And in doing that, the French regulars deployed on the road. I had them deploy on the road, which gives them double speed. And so they essentially were able to get up and, kind of get up around the house here, which the plan was to just give themselves a bit of cover and just try to approach. My basic premise in my head for the solo game was that the French were basically approaching a British town, and the British were responding to that. So initially the British actually showed up late. I suppose their messenger took a while to get to them to let them know that the town was being invaded. Now at this point the British did end up showing up, but like I mentioned, they showed up sort of late, and so they deployed here. The thought was here that the larger group of British were going to try to face off here, given the buildings and the layout and where they ended up randomly deploying. The idea was that the smaller group would hopefully be able to circle around and flank a bit, while the larger group would hold off the main force that would be approaching. One thing that did end up happening early in the game, there were a number of random events. Some of them didn't apply in the timing of them. They didn't have any effect on the game. But other ones like this one made a big difference. 3 cards did come out, and it happens often in the game. You can count on random events happening, I think, in Sharpe's practice, is what it seems. But the step out lads, a roll of 6, which gave them bonus to their movement, happened. So oftentimes I worry when random events happen, but in Sharpe practice you can get good ones as well. And so despite actually showing up late, the British ended up having a bit of skip in their step with their main group, which allowed them some extra movement bonus within the first round. This allowed them to not only move forward further, but also allowed them to position themselves to angle a bit their formation. The idea being able to form a line quickly. By this point, the smaller group as well had ran in order to get around the little building here, and they did take 1 point of shock in doing that. French Marines were able to then start firing on the front part of that formation of the main group of the British, and did actually cause a casualty and 3 shock. Pretty impressive considering it was still at long range, and they were essentially using 8 shots. They got 3 points of shock and a casualty. We must have been in round 2 at this point, because we're using leader cards again. But essentially, the group of regulars for the French decided they needed to position as fast as possible, coming around the corner and seeing what was happening with the main group of the British. And so they essentially positioned and got themselves into a firing line, getting ready to fire on the main group of the British while they have their flank exposed. The British ended up drawing a 4th command card and used that in order to get into their firing line and also present their weapons. And then the random tipping card comes out and ends the action for the moment, which is kind of a bit of a nail-biting point here. In the next round, the British elect to use their 2 command cards to activate a unit that's not activated yet, and decided that they needed to get the jump on the French rather than save the cards and wait for the normal leader's turn to come out, force the situation, and make sure that they get the first shot. This, I think, was one of the defining moments in the game, and it could have really went either way at this moment. The British had some tremendously bad shooting. If you actually count out the amount of shots that were possibly delivered out, I mean, minus the sort of casualty that happened and the shock that was on the small amount of shock that was from the Marines at the beginning of the turn, there was still, you know, in the area of 20 shots, as I remember. I mean, you're basically taking, at the most, there could have been in full strength 8, 16, 24, plus another 2 for the leader commanding at 26. But really, we had some minuses to those numbers. And so when we rolled the dice, we still had handfuls and handfuls of dice. And it was probably the largest amount of dice thrown in the game, and not one casualty. Now, granted, shock is a bigger prevailing factor, I think, within this game, and very important. And so getting shock at sometimes can be better than getting casualties, but not one casualty and 6 points of shock on this group. 2 groups, I should say, this formation. And so I felt that that was a fairly good result for the French to be subjected to that and just have that as the outcome. I will note that as I started the game, I was putting all of the shock on the formation, but as I was reading the rules and playing through the game, I had to split it out per group because shock is actually meant to be split. When hits are actually on the formation, but then the results of the hits are split out to the individual groups, and so I adjusted in game for that as I was learning it again. I think this must have been actually a couple of rounds later in the altercation, because we do actually have one. No, actually, there's no Frenchman dead. That's just spot on the movement tray for the leader next to the unit. But the French have rallied off shock over time. We're able to. And it does look like the French have actually caused some casualties already on the British. It was quite significant, the amount of shock and casualties. And so, in my experience, the shooting made a big difference. I mean, dice still do make a difference within this game, and the French did much better in their marksmanship in this particular match, altercation. And so when we look at the British, they actually, and at this point I was correctly assigning shock to individual groups within the formation, and it was quite significant. The French had an excellent round of firing. I think this may have been the time, but there was a point where I think they only had 2 misses out of like 18 dice or something like that. It was just ridiculous. At this point, after more firing back and forth, and that red sort of token that I have in front of them there, that's normally was meant for shock. It comes with the 2 Fat Lardy stuff. I ended up going with mini dice for shock, but I'm using that just to demonstrate when somebody's fired and they haven't reloaded yet. And so this unit that was on the top that was being shot at by both the Marines and, I say the top, I mean the bottom in the photo, both the Marines and the regulars, and at this point was forced to start withdrawing. And so that broke up the formation. By this point as well, you can't see it in this photo here, but that small group of British that was looking to flank was making it around the building. And so the Marines repositioned and got ready to fire on them as they circled around the building. And the British did sort of play right into that. With the way it worked out, the Marines did get the jump on them and got the first shots in, and really did well. I mean, they ended up just literally 8 soldiers on 8 soldiers as far as firing, ended up causing 2 casualties and 2 points of shock on that British group. This is really where I sort of left off. I wasn't able to finish the game. I don't know if any of you have ever played a game while reading the rules, but it actually took me many, many hours to go through all of this, and I never actually finished the game completely. It was time to actually have dinner, or at least look towards the end of my Sunday with the family. And so I got out of it kind of what I had hoped to. What we sort of see here is there was another volley that was somewhat successful by the remaining 2 groups of the British on the French. There were 2 casualties taken in total by this formation, and they ended up with 10 shock, which is quite getting up there, although not at a point to start forcing them to withdraw at all. And essentially, it's hard to know how this would have ended up, but I think if we were to just kind of stop it here, the British were essentially starting to withdraw and getting a bit decimated in this altercation. It seemed as if the French had the upper hand. However, if it was to go on, you never know. The remaining 2 groups were that didn't withdraw were starting to do better against the French, and it would be hard to know without finishing it off. And so I had a really good time trying to learn these rules again, and just, it was really, sometimes it's difficult for me to, particularly when it's just solo gaming and it's not, playing with a game with a friend or something, to resist the draw when I do have hobby time to go to the painting table, because that's where I like to spend most of my time. But this was refreshing, to dedicate the time on a Sunday to just pulling out my French Indian War miniatures and breaking the seal on not doing anything with them, because I've really felt that I have not, particularly with the current situation with gaming, with COVID and things, I've just not made an effort to game at all. And so, yeah, so I really enjoy this, and I'm looking to most likely do this again, and it should go a lot quicker, and I'm hoping to get a full game in. So I hope you guys enjoyed that. And yeah, if you have any questions or comments on what I've done, you feel free to leave comments below. Take care.